Well, thanks so much, everybody, for joining us today for actually the fifth in this series. Yeah, so basically the focus of this series for people who are new to it is the fact that we need to um, approach the new coronavirus from quite a few different angles, and a really important one is nutrition. As we've seen in recent episodes, four of them, in fact. The weeks are really going on, aren't they? Hard to believe this is the fifth session. So please check out previous sessions on YouTube if you haven't already. But today I'll take you through a quick review. Oh, first, yes, we need to have our obligatory warning. Thanks to Eric from Ottawa. And basically, the key thing about the warning is that the information that I'm about to present is so powerful that it can improve your health so quickly that you might need to talk to your doctor. And that's because your health can improve so fast that you might need to adjust medications, or you might develop various improvements that can hit you so quickly you'll have to have your doctor help you to maybe even get off all your medication totally. And I can ask Eric towards the end, as he's joined us today, what the update is on his blood pressure. So just in a few weeks, it's amazing what can happen. So today I'll take you through a very quick review some of the sources of nutrition confusion. And today's topic is carbohydrates. And we're going to talk about why carbohydrates are bad for us. But uh, paradoxically, why low carb, no carb diets are very bad for us. And if carbs are so bad for us, why would low carb diets be even worse for us? Well, we'll answer that dilemma, and actually we'll end by talking about why high carb diets are actually so helpful. And of course, stay tuned because the best is last. Great new recipe this week. Hope that you've had a chance to try out the recipes in past weeks. Um, this is a good one today. Okay, quick review. The inspiration for this series again is the fact that the coronavirus disproportionately and overwhelmingly affects people with so-called comorbidities. And one of the interconnecting elements of the health issues that people have that make them more susceptible is the dysfunction of the endothelium, which is the inner lining of our arteries, which produces nitric oxide. And in the very first lecture of this series, check it out on YouTube if you haven't already, I went through that in detail and how we could actually produce more nitric oxide and help to restore the function of our endothelium. One of the key elements is green leafy vegetables. Which ones? Well, I love reading out the list, but as my great inspiration, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, enjoys to do, but I'll skip it today. You can review it from past sessions. So what's the important message is that most of the comorbidities that are so important for this coronavirus are actually reversible conditions. Hypertension can be reversed, type 2 diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, all reversible conditions. Here, for example, are clogged arteries. We can see can be reversed. Actual pictures of patients who just worked with physicians to radically change their eating habits, other lifestyle habits in some cases, and actually reverse their cardiovascular disease. Last week, I was very wonderfully had my brother, Dr. Chris Milburn, join me to talk about obesity as a risk factor for COVID-19. And if you haven't checked that one out, please do. It's up on YouTube, like all the other ones, and it's an excellent discussion. Thanks, Chris. Talking about obesity, the problem of obesity, and essentially, again, how to reverse the condition, why it's an important risk factor for the COVID-19. And one of the themes that we talked about last week is how we've created a cultural food environment that to take a positive direction, it's almost like swimming against the current. The deck is stacked against us. The proverbial deck is really stacked against us. We talked last week about how government, industry, and science have all colluded to, along with our genes, our basic biology, to collude against us to take us in the wrong direction. Yeah, but a big theme, I think, today is we need to swim against the current, but there are so many different directions. And there's so much confusion. My daughter, presently age 13, not able to go to school. One of the things I'm working with her is nutrition. We're studying a university text on nutrition, which we're both enjoying. I used to use the text when I was a professor myself years ago. And actually, we just did a chapter on, we're going through the so-called macronutrients: carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and actually alcohol. I won't go into that, but that's considered one of the macronutrients. I thought I'd do a series of 3 weeks talking about the macronutrients. And, you know, there's just so much confusion about even the most basic elements of nutrition. So it's easy to say that people have to swim against the current, but there's many different branches. Which current do you try to swim against, and what direction do you try to go in? Nowhere do we see more confusion than carbohydrates, fats too as well, and proteins. So I'll talk about all those things in next few weeks. But carbohydrates today, confusion reigns, I think, is a great way to describe the situation with carbohydrates. Let me just take a few minutes and I'll try to go through where I see the sources of confusion. It's very difficult. I mean, if you're going to start to poke away and make choices about good nutrition, you get on the internet, you start to read different things, and suddenly you're reading all kinds of contradictory information. And how do you make sense of that? Well, the media hasn't helped at all. For example, Time Magazine many esteemed publications. I don't know if you want to call Time Magazine an esteemed publication, but certainly a mainstream publication. Eat butter. Scientists labeled fat the enemy. Why were wrong. Really? I mean, talk to your doctor. Ask your doctor, okay, I'm going to do a little experiment. I'm going to eat an extra 3 sticks of butter a week for the next month, and I want you to check my cholesterol before and after the month is over. Now, if your doctor is sensible, they'll say, oh my God, that's one of the worst things you can do. I don't even know if you'll survive the month without having a heart attack. But if you do, what you'll get to see is your cholesterol will dramatically get elevated. And in fact, you'll gain weight and all kinds of things will happen to you. And if you don't believe me, just give it a try. But Time Magazine seems to know otherwise. Government hasn't helped us either, because for a long time, the nutrition information, nutrition guidelines put out by government were heavily influenced by industries. The exception, now this is a comic from the United States Department of Agriculture, which has a job to promote the meat and dairy industries, as well as promote good nutrition amongst the public, which is kind of a contradictory set of goals. Now, in Canada, I'm very pleased to report that the most recent updated food guide information has actually been wonderful. For the first time in Canada, they created a group of people not influenced by industry and put out a wonderful food guide. I don't think many people have read it, let alone read the fine print, but it is a wonderful document. So check it out for yourself. Dietitians, I don't think, to be fair to them, they do a lot of good work, but they have a mantra among dietitians that everything within moderation, and you can fit all foods into a healthy lifestyle. And I hope I convinced people who checked out last week's session. Check it out on YouTube again if you haven't seen it. About Chris and I talked about obesity, and we essentially have food companies and science that have manipulated food to create the bliss point, the perfect point where we get a hyper stimulation from the food to the point where we have difficulty in enjoying the taste of real foods. So I think within that context, it's hard to imagine that you could have a moderate amount of cakes, candies, cookies, pies. You get the picture. And it's a lot like smoking. I mean, if you were to take 3-pack-a-day smokers and suggest to them, okay, let's cut down to 2.5 packs a day, you don't really see much improvement in people's health. You really need to take smokers, 3-pack-a-day smokers, and you need to get them to quit smoking. And when they do that, their health dramatically improves. You can do a harm reduction approach and try to get people to cut back. Instead of cakes, pies, cookies, ice cream, you try to go from 20% of your daily calories from sugar down to 15% or maybe 10%. Sure, that helps, but you're just not going to get to the point where you're going to see the reversal of underlying disease processes. What about the medical profession? Perhaps Chris can weigh in towards the end of this session, but my own take is the medical profession is very busy. They don't have nutritional education or experience. And the ones who would think of it often don't think patients can change. And also, there are widespread beliefs that even things that like obesity is a complex chronic disorder. In other words, there's no real help for somebody because it's chronic. We could help them a little bit, but they'll never be cured. Um, and one of the biggest things for me is the internet. I mean, the internet and social media are just amazing. There's such a plethora of uh, different points of view that are completely contradictory, and you can read each one of them, and they all sound very convincing. So the question is, how does a person actually sift through that information and find a direction? I guess a lot of people will find a direction that seems appealing to them based on wishful thinking, emotions. Who knows? I mean, it's very hard to sift through all of the contradictory information. I'm amazed myself. I know an awful lot about nutrition. I read a lot of studies, and I'm just amazed to read things and how convincing people can sound, even though they don't really have a clue what they're talking about. Along that line, I should outline my own inspirations that helped to take me in the correct direction. One, when I was a professor, my interest was studying traditional dietary patterns, especially the ones that would lead to excellent health and longevity. Also, there's been a clear, consistent dietary pattern that's been used to reverse disease, not just prevent it, but to actually reverse it. I talked in previous sessions about Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn as just one example. He visited Sydney, Nova Scotia a few years back, and he was brought in by the medical doctors group here in Sydney. Uh, his um, his talk was recorded when he was here, and I would encourage people to check that out on YouTube for themselves, just to get an example of a doctor who spent the last 3 decades working with patients to reverse cardiovascular disease in that particular case. Also, I'm very interested in what top professors see. One of the things about medical and nutrition research is that people get a lot of knowledge about a little tiny thing about nutrition, and they don't really pay attention to big picture stuff. So what interests me are some of the top professors who are interested in the big picture stuff. Um, and also I read hundreds of research reports every year, and I look to see a clear consensus. And what you need to realize about the media is that we might have 100 research studies that will say one thing very clearly, and then one comes along to contradict it, tells you something different, and that ends up on the front page of the newspaper. So we get eggs are good for us one day, then they're bad for us. That sort of thing happens back and forth. But in science, if you see 100 studies that say one thing and one contradicts it, then most likely it's probably wrong, and very quickly it's usually retracted or something like that. But you don't get that information in the media. But the most important thing for me is that working with people for over 20 years now, just to see how quickly people change for the better, how radically their health can improve with getting people in the right direction. And there's just, there's a lot of details we still don't know about nutrition around the edges, but in the big picture, couldn't be more clear than it ever was. And it's too bad that message isn't getting out. Uh, and one of the major sources of confusion these days is the carbs, as people call them, and we've had this kind of consistent argument about whether it's fat or the carbs. And if we look at what are the extra calories behind the obesity epidemic, we took a look at this last time. So between 1970 and 2010, people on average are eating about 500 calories more every day. Now, that's a lot of calories, extra calories every day. Where did this come from? Well, you can see that the first source is actually added fats and oils and more fatty dairy products. So people are getting an awful lot of extra calories from fat. So it is fat, but it's also the carbs. Take a look at this. We're actually eating 34 extra calories every day from extra sugars and sweeteners, but 173 extra calories from white flour, cereal products, all these highly processed grains. So we have highly processed grains, we have extra sugars, and that's a problem for sure. But so is the fat. So it is the fat and it is the sugar. It's both, and hopefully I can clear that up in the next few sessions. But okay, so some people have fixated on the fact that the carbs are bad for us, and that's there's a consensus that added sugars, are not good for us. Highly processed grains are not good for us. So what's that's led to is low carb diets, keto diet, which is an extreme kind of form of carbohydrate avoidance. In fact, to get your carbohydrate intake down so low that you're really not able to use to get all the carbohydrates you need to fuel your nervous system and your brain, so your body starts to produce ketones from fat metabolism. And so that's called the keto diet, which is extremely low carbohydrate. And the theory is that, a fruit, for example, is bad for you, many of these kind of foods. It's very interesting. I would describe it as a non sequitur. Basically, just because the kinds of carbohydrates that are found in the modern industrial type of cultures with highly processed grains, added sugars, unquestionably those are deleterious to our health. But it doesn't follow that we shouldn't eat fruit. Just because if we add fructose and sucrose and even actually artificial sugar substitutes can be deleterious to our health for complex reasons as well. But it's a non sequitur that because added sugars and highly processed carbohydrates are not good for us, that that essentially all carbohydrates must be bad for us. And I think that's the essential fallacy that people make. Yeah, it'd be kind of fun to go through all this, but I'll spare you the technical scientific details. But essentially, this gets us into diabetes, for example, and nowhere would it be easy to say, okay, diabetes is a health condition where people have trouble managing and tolerating carbohydrates. So it makes sense that intuitively that carbohydrate must be the problem. If people didn't eat carbohydrate, they wouldn't have diabetes. Well, no, in fact, that's wrong. It's actually called in the medical literature, it's lipotoxicity. Lipo means fat, and toxicity, of course, is the toxic condition. So what actually happens, the model of diabetes, and check it out for yourself. Do a PubMed search for lipotoxicity diabetes, and you'll come up with hundreds and hundreds of papers that show that toxic fat metabolites get into our cells, and those metabolites interfere with the ability of insulin to send its signal into the cell. So there's a cascade of all kinds of effects from the toxicity of fats that get into the cell. So it's intramyocellular fat, which basically means fat that gets inside muscle cells uh, in our body, and the fat interferes with the ability of the insulin to send a signal so the cell can take the sugar out of our blood. So paradoxically, if we avoid carbohydrates and we eat more and more fat, the fat toxicity builds up more and more in the cells, and it can actually make you less able to tolerate carbohydrates. That's just another detail of all the underlying processes that relate to how fat toxicity causes a whole cascade of effects inside cells that lead to diabetes. So diabetes is probably our most obvious condition that you would think that would be related to eating carbohydrates, when in fact it isn't a disease. It's a disease of fat toxicity inside the cells. Now, where does the fat come from? It can come from both eating fat, but also eating added sugars, which the body turns into fat to store. So in other words, if you think about eating a piece of fruit, it might have fructose in it, but the metabolic effect is completely different than if you just consume added fructose, which goes very quickly absorbed into the liver, and the liver will turn into fat to store it because it has extra fat, in a sense, extra calories that need to be put into storage. So the fat comes from sugar, comes from carbohydrates, and also comes from fat. In fact, it's easier to store fat and bring it into the body if it's fat than it is if it's sugar, because the body has to work to turn the sugar and carbs into fat. But both sugar and carbs of the common types that people eat cause excess fat, as does excess fat. So yes, it's the sugar and the fat and the carbs that people commonly eat. So let me convince you, there's so many different interesting examples we can take, but I'll just take a few without going on too long. I could talk for a long time, as you're getting the impression. Let's talk about Okinawa for a second. It's just one of many examples where people have a very famous type of diet that's associated with longevity. So the first question is, do people in Okinawa really actually live that old, or is it a myth? Well, they've done quite a few studies where they have actually validated that there are a disproportionate amount of people who live to be quite elderly. And one of the things you'll notice about them is they have very thin body types. They have very good blood pressure, very good cholesterol, all that kind of stuff has been studied extensively. But the question is, what do they eat? Well, they eat a lot of carbs. In fact, 1949 study, the main source of energy in their diet, 70% of the energy in the traditional Okinawan diet actually came from sweet potatoes. Very interesting. They eat purple sweet potatoes quite a lot, I think, and notice there's some rice and wheat, barley, and other things, which would have been whole grains. And really just, I mean, you can't see very little added oils, very little, a little bit of fish, you'll notice, very little eggs and dairy, that's, that sort of thing. I'll send this article. You can read it for yourself. This is a BBC article. A high carb diet may explain why Okinawans live so long. So there's quite a few research groups that are studying the benefits of a lot of carbohydrates in the diet which helps to protect the body from the effects of aging. So you can read that for yourself, but there's a lot of scientists that are looking at that. So it's very interesting. We have this plethora of internet popular books telling us that carbs are going to kill us, but there's research groups out there telling us that we should actually eat a high carbohydrate diet to live a long, healthy life. So that's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? It's interesting. So what's the answer to the dilemma? I don't think it's that probably most of you listening in are probably converted already, or quite aware of the fact that there's good carbs and there's bad carbs, and the carbohydrates that are commonly eaten, if you go to any restaurant, you're going to get foods full of added sugars. Very hard to find whole grain products, very hard to find legumes, just not common foods, fruits and vegetables, sweet potatoes, all that sort of thing, all those kind of healthy carbs. And it's quite simple. It's not a complex thing. We don't have to avoid carbohydrates. We have to take the average person consumes close to 20% of their daily calories. Let me say that again. 20% of average person's daily calories comes from added sugars. That's a huge amount. That's over 100 pounds of added sugars every year. 100 pounds. A friend of mine who's a paramedic has given talks to other paramedic groups over the years on nutrition, and he once brought a wheelbarrow full of 100 pounds of sugar into his talk and put it up to the front. This wheelbarrow, just you can imagine that, a wheelbarrow full of 100 pounds of sugar. And he looked out at the room and said, "This is what you eat every year in added sugars. 100 pounds. That's stunning if you think about it." So that's the problem. Not beans, not mangoes, not apples. Okay, well, I mean, there's a lot to be said for it, but one of my favorite nutrition professors in Canada, he doesn't get enough attention. He's an emeritus professor now, but David Jenkins, University of Toronto, look up his research. Amazing stuff. He does a lot of research on actual people, giving people different diets, seeing what happens to people, not just pieces of food, and seeing that how that affects one little aspect of physiology. He actually takes whole dietary patterns, feeds them to people. So here was a study where they fed people 20 fruits a day. So you imagine stuffing yourself full of 20 fruit servings every day. That's a lot of fruit. Anything bad happen? No, in fact, everything happened. Everything that happened was something very good. Chris might be interested to see. Nice drop in the lipoprotein A. LDL cholesterol dropped considerably. Blood pressure dropped. Everything dropped. Body weight dropped, and this was just in a 2-week period. This data. And here's another interesting thing: the effect of the high fiber whole vegetable and fruit diet, and they eat quite a lot of vegetables along with this diet as well. I'll read it out to you. Because the fecal outputs observed in the men are the highest we are aware of in the literature in response to a dietary intervention in healthy subjects. Yeah, well, you heard me right. They got the biggest bowel movements they'd ever seen in a research study. So that's impressive, especially if you're a British person and you try to keep track of such things. Yeah, the University of Bristol actually is the famous center for studying fecal output. Check that out. You can Google that. It's quite interesting. This isn't from their data, this little curve down below. This is actually stool weight versus colon cancer risk. And what you can see is that as our stool weight gets bigger and bigger, colon cancer virtually disappears. Our typical diet, our stool weight tends to be about, I hope everybody already had lunch. Sorry for the, I should have given a trigger warning about the stool weight. Anyway, here we are, we're into it now, so there's no going back. So if you look at our typical diet, we eat about 15, 18 grams of fiber, or less than that, so we get pretty small stool weights. By the time we get up to a half-pound stool, the colon cancer is getting very low, like 1/5, 1/6 of the rate. And if we can get ourselves up to a 1-pounder, where Dr. Jenkins was up to, and some African cultures have, we pretty well have almost no risk of colon cancer. So that's quite interesting. So we have a few chat comments. I suppose a few people were able to read that. Why don't we just open things up to a few questions. If people want to ask, you can either type in the chat box, or you can ask the question. And yeah, so Chris told us that it's interesting that data shows that smokers who try to cut down in preparation for quitting are less likely to quit than smokers who just quit. The conclusion of the research is that cutting down is stress-inducing, and doing it over months is harder than just quitting, which gives us a shorter period of stress and craving. The analogy to eating is that folks who just eliminate crap from their diets find it more achievable than trying to cut down, since the period of discomfort is shorter. So that's an excellent comment. Thanks, Chris. Any further comments? I just had to mute people because we were getting some little bit of music. Some people found some music more entertaining than listening to me, I guess.
Yeah, that's a real slap in the face, eh?
Yes, exactly.
Mike, my blood pressure this morning was 111/67. So I'm going to take a look at, I think I'll drop the blood pressure pill altogether come Sunday and track that and see how that works out.
Thanks for sharing that, Eric. 111/67, that's not bad for somebody even 30 years old in our culture.
One other thing that I've noted, and I don't know whether it's related to vegetables or blood pressure or what the heck it is, but as you may be aware, my left eye had age-related macular degeneration in it. And you check that with the Amsler grid. You look for pincushion or barrel distortion, that and disappearance of the central image. I woke up this morning and I looked out. We have vertical Venetians on our windows and door in the bedroom. I looked out and said, "No, I don't see any distortion there." So I went down and I checked it on the Amsler grid, and sure enough, there is just a wee bit, but nothing like it was before. So as soon as I can get a hold of my my dear old ophthalmologists, They put a thing on their website yesterday saying we're open for business. Give us a call. I shall and get them to check how much of that the drusen layer is in the retina of the eye to see whether that is in fact diminished somewhat. It's my theory that that's related to blood flow. So they don't necessarily agree with me, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Eric. That's wonderful. And one of the things you see is that, as I say, there's a common dietary pattern that can reverse all of these different diseases. So it isn't specific to this disease or that disease. So what you see is people might focus on really improving their diet so their blood pressure improves and they don't require medications for their blood pressure. And then the side effects are all positive things that are sometimes surprising, you know.
Yeah, all
Yeah,
over the place.
yeah, exactly. And I think you're right. The pressure could be part of the picture, but really also increasing your consumption of green leafy vegetables. There's a lot of the elements, anthins, and all these types of different phytochemicals that are really beneficial for for the for the eyes as well.
Yeah,
That yeah,
certainly that's true. The what they call ARIDS 2 vitamin pills that they prescribe for that have a lot of the vitamins in there are those related to vegetables.
that's right.
Lutein for one.
Eh,
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. That's right. So by pumping yourself in those high doses of vegetables, you're going to be getting very high doses of those same nutrients.
yes, yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. Any other comments? As I say, feel free to type them into the chat if you have a question, or feel free to unmute yourself and pipe in if you would like to have have yourself recorded on YouTube. Chris, any comments yourself?
No, I don't think I have anything in particular to add. I'll just sort of pile on a bit and say one of the big problems that I face in the little bit of time that I get to do any nutritional speaking with people, because most times I'm dealing with more acute issues, and that's maybe last thing on somebody's mind when they're bleeding profusely from a wound. But um, one of my struggles in Cape Breton is that a lot of people really think that they have a good diet, but they're comparing it to other people in Cape Breton, and that's pretty low bar. You know what I mean? And so I think when people are trying to judge whether the diet is good or bad here in Cape Breton, they really shouldn't look around them and pat themselves on the back for being better than other people in their community. They really do need to look at those bigger pictures, like you're presenting things like what's a diet in Okinawa, what's a diet in in some country in Africa where it's plant-based diet, and then how does Cape Breton's diet compare to that, and try to judge and really reach for the stars a little more rather than just being happy that we're a little better than people around us.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm sure clinically these days you're seeing a lot of people attracted to low carb and keto diets and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's great, Mike. Maybe I will comment a little more on that. I'll even turn on my video for this one. Not that I'm that great to look at or anything, but um, I am seeing that a lot. A lot of people jumping on the paleo and the keto and all these things. And I think these diets are really attractive because what they allow is they allow for people to eat a lot of these addictive foods, the high fat. Oh, great, here's a diet that lets me eat everything wrapped in bacon. You know what I mean? And I can see why that's attractive to people who like those kind of foods. Um, the, the problem with diets, I've explained this many times through my life to many patients, but every diet makes you lose weight. It could be the South Beach diet, the Atkins diet, the grapefruit diet, the water diet, the plant-based diet, the diet, right? Every diet makes you lose weight, but it makes you lose weight because it's a diet and you're actually thinking about what you're eating at that time. So it's, you know, basically it's a placebo effect. Just like every pill we give people helps many of them, because people are really thinking about it and they think the pill will work. And the diet is the same thing. People start on a diet, they start to count their calories, whether it's calories of bacon or calories of plants or calories of whatever. They start to reduce their amounts and they're concerned, and they're usually exercising at the same time because, you know, this is my time, I'm going on a diet. So the real proof is not in whether the diet makes you lose weight over the first 6 to 8 weeks, because they all do. The proof is this a healthy diet long term? Is it sustainable? Is it something that's good for me? And it's pretty clear that these you know, high fat, high protein, low carb diets, yes, they work in the short term because everything does, but in the long term, there's many harmful side effects, and that more people seem to die. And we had talked about a study a few weeks ago that was looking at these low carb diets in diabetics, and it showed that they lost weight and their sugars improved, but they actually died more. So, you know, that's it's great to pat yourself on the back because your sugars improved, but then if you're dead 3 weeks later, it wasn't really a success, I would say. So yeah, that'd be my last comment. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. And for those who haven't seen the past few weeks, I showed the what I call the low carb death curve, which is exactly what Chris just mentioned, which shows that the more people restrict carbohydrates, the higher the risk of actual dying. So people can lose weight, but they can end up being buried in a smaller coffin if that's any benefit to the family. So check that out in a previous sessions, the low carb death curve. The other comment that I think that I have of the popularity of these diets is that to try to choose healthy carbs, for example, it's very difficult to go to restaurants and find lentils and whole grain pasta and those kind of very healthy foods. Desserts with fruit salads or something. I mean, it's very unusual to find choices like that at restaurants. But a person can go to a restaurant and find all they have to do is order the steak and not eat the baked potato that comes with it, and they can follow a low carb diet or a keto diet. So in other words, I think from a practical sense, it's easy to follow those kind of diets compared to choosing the healthiest foods, which are not readily in abundance in many environments. So, any further questions before we switch over to our recipe? Okay, let's talk about the recipe of the day. My major complaint with this recipe, or I'd say limitation, probably doesn't have enough green leafy vegetables to dramatically increase your nitric oxide production. So you could grab a handful of kale at the same time as you're eating this, or you could add a lot more cilantro and maybe some parsley as well. But as you can see from the picture, it's a black bean and mango salad, and I would highly, highly, highly recommend everyone to try this recipe. Absolutely delicious, gorgeous looking. The mixture of colors and the flavors that come at you are just absolutely delightful. This is a recipe in my own family that we will make once, at least once a week, and probably more often in the summer because it's so quick and doesn't require any cooking. What are the ingredients? Essentially, black beans, easy to just open up a can, not doesn't require cooking. Get yourself some low salt, no salt canned black beans, rinse them, you're good to go. Key thing with the mango is to make sure the mango is nice and ripe. unripe mangoes are a little bit tart. You need to have a mango that really has that lovely sweetness, and a little bit of extra red pepper is excellent just for the color. Green onions, cilantro, and in fact, you could easily cilantro is interesting ingredient. There's research that shows that there's different kinds of people. Some people genetically actually cilantro tastes like soap. Um, there's people like me that really, I can't taste cilantro myself. I eat it because it's good for me, but I can't really taste it. And other people just absolutely love it. So if you're one of these people that can't taste it, then it's no big deal. If you find it tastes like soap, switch to parsley, quite easy. Um, if you have 2 people in the household or 3 people or more, chop up some parsley, chop up some cilantro, and people can add their own choice at the table itself. So you don't have to mix it in. You can use it as a table condiment that people can use. Pack on the celery, the cilantro or the parsley. Um, Myself, when I make this recipe, I will tend to use pumpkin seeds or chopped almonds or something instead of the olive oil. I'll usually try to use some whole nuts and seeds, not cooked. You could toast them a little bit, add a little bit of flavor. No, not. I don't tend to put much salt on. Each person could put a tiny bit of salt as they wish at the table, and lime juice. That combination of lime and mango makes for an absolutely delicious recipe. Gorgeous looking. Um, Never serve this recipe to people who didn't really love it. So we'll take a few more questions before we end up, but once again, this will be posted to YouTube. So if you want to check it out again, I'll be sending out the recipe to everyone. I'll also send out that the article on the BBC about the high carb diet and why it's so potentially very useful for longevity. And thanks for tuning in. And let's have some more questions if ever anybody has them. It's an interesting topic, I think, given the fact that so many people are quite convinced that carbohydrates are bad for our health, when I think the opposite is clearly the case from looking at research, and try it yourself. See what your own experience is. Any further questions? Oh, okay. So Inga, not from Ottawa, but from Sydney, she is asking about the 3-2-1 recipe. Oh, and we did get an interesting comment as well that at least I didn't share pictures to illustrate stool weight. Well, that's thanks, Chris, for that. In fact, you can Google University of Bristol stool scale, and you can actually see if you're in the right zone. The University of Bristol, highly recommend checking them out. 3-2-1 recipe is basically a pancake recipe, very easy, quick to make. 3 bananas, 2 cups of oatmeal, and 1 cup of your favorite plant milk, soy milk, hemp milk, almond milk, whatever you prefer, without any added sugar. Put it in a blender until you get a batter, and you're good to go to make a pancake. And if you're having that for breakfast, you just need to add your green leafy vegetables into the mix. So any further questions? Anybody want to add their 2 cents worth as far as the experience of people with low carb diets, high carb diets? What has anybody's experience been?